baby saw a bear cub trapped in a pet food store. Storage, what baby did next, fed souls. The evening air hung heavy with the scent of approaching rain as Ethan Marshall pushed the shopping cart through the nearly empty aisles of Peterson's Pet Supply, the old family-owned store that had served their small mountain town for 3 generations. His wife, Jessica, walked beside him, gently bouncing their 10-month-old daughter Lily on her hip while the baby played with a colorful set of plastic keys that jangled softly with each movement. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting long shadows between the towering shelves of dog food and cat litter, and somewhere in the distance, they could hear the faint sound of Mr. Peterson counting the day's receipts at the register. It was that peculiar time of evening when the world seemed to pause between day and night, when ordinary moments had a way of becoming something more, though neither Ethan nor Jessica could have imagined just how extraordinary this particular evening would become. Lily had been fussy all afternoon, her tiny gums swollen from teething, and the trip to the pet store was as much about getting her out of the house as it was about picking up food for their golden retriever Max, who waited patiently at home. The baby's whimpers had finally quieted as she became fascinated by the colorful bags of pet food lining the shelves, her wide blue eyes tracking the cartoon animals that decorated each package. Jessica adjusted her hold on Lily, feeling the familiar weight of motherhood in her arms, that constant awareness of another life depending entirely on her care and protection. She remembered how terrified she had been when they first brought Lily home from the hospital, how every small sound the baby made sent her into a panic, wondering if something was wrong. Now, 10 months later, she had learned to read her daughter's signals like a language only mothers could understand, though there were still moments when Lily surprised her with reactions she couldn't quite predict or explain. As they turned down the last aisle near the back of the store, something changed in the air around them. It was subtle at first, like the shift in pressure before a storm, but Lily noticed it immediately. The baby's head snapped up from where it had been resting against Jessica's shoulder, her tiny fingers releasing the plastic keys which clattered to the floor. Ethan bent to retrieve them, but Lily wasn't interested in her toy anymore. Instead, she stared intently toward the back wall of the store, where a door marked "Storage, Employees Only" stood slightly ajar. Her little hand reached out in that direction, fingers opening and closing in the universal baby gesture for want. But there was something different about her expression, something that made both parents pause. It wasn't the demanding look she got when she wanted a bottle or the excited bounce when she saw something colorful. This was something else entirely, a focused intensity that seemed almost beyond her years. "What is it, sweetheart?" Jessica whispered, following her daughter's gaze to the storage room door. The store had grown quieter somehow. Even the constant hum of the refrigeration unit seemed to fade into the background. Ethan stood up slowly, the plastic keys forgotten in his hand, as he too noticed the strange quality of the silence that had settled over them. It wasn't an empty silence, but rather one that seemed full of possibility, pregnant with something waiting to be discovered. Then they heard it, so soft at first that they might have missed it if not for Lily's continued fixation on that door. It was a sound that didn't belong in a pet store at closing time, not the scurrying of mice or the settling of old wood, but something alive and desperate, something that pulled at a primal part of their hearts before their minds could even process what they were hearing. The sound came again, clearer this time, and Lily made a small noise in response. Not quite a word, but clearly an attempt at communication. Her whole body leaned toward the storage room, and Jessica had to adjust her grip to keep the baby from lunging forward. "Did you hear that?" she asked Ethan, though she could see from his expression that he had. He nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving the door as he took a step closer. The sound was like a whimper, but not from a dog or cat, something wilder and more vulnerable at the same time. It tugged at something deep inside them. That human instinct to help, to protect, to understand. Ethan looked back at his wife and daughter, seeing his own curiosity reflected in Jessica's eyes, while Lily continued to reach toward the door with increasing urgency. "Maybe we should get Mr. Peterson," Jessica suggested. But even as she said it, she found herself moving closer to the door along with Ethan. There was something about the moment that felt too delicate to break, as if calling for help might shatter whatever was happening here. The storage room door creaked slightly as a draft from somewhere pushed it open another inch, and through the gap, they could see only darkness and the vague shapes of stacked boxes and bags. The sound came again, louder now, definitely an animal in distress. But there was something else, too, a rustling, like something trying to move but unable to, trapped, perhaps, among the supplies. Ethan reached for the door handle. His movement slow and deliberate, not wanting to startle whatever was inside. "Stay back a little," he told Jessica, though she only took a half-step backward, Lily still straining in her arms toward the mystery beyond the door. As Ethan pushed the door open wider, the storage room's automatic light flickered on, illuminating a scene that made all three of them freeze in place. There, in the far corner between a tower of dog food bags and a shelf of cleaning supplies, was something that absolutely should not have been in a pet store storage room in their small mountain town. It was small, no bigger than a medium-sized dog, covered in dark brown fur that stuck up in places as if it had been wrestling with something. But it wasn't a dog. That much was immediately clear from the shape of its head, the particular way it held its paws, the unmistakable profile of a creature that belonged in the wild forests that surrounded their town, not trapped in a storage room that smelled of kibble and industrial cleaner. It was a bear cub, and it was terrified. The little creature pressed itself further into the corner as the light came on, its eyes wide and reflecting the fluorescent glare like two amber coins. One of its paws was tangled in what looked like a plastic bag that had once held dog treats, the handles wrapped around its leg in a way that must have been both frustrating and frightening for such a young animal. The cub made that sound again, the whimper that had drawn them here, and Lily responded with a soft cooing noise that seemed to surprise even her. The baby had gone completely still in Jessica's arms, no longer reaching but simply watching with an intensity that seemed impossible for someone so young. The cub's eyes moved from Ethan to Jessica and then settled on Lily, and something shifted in its expression, the terror softening just slightly into something more like curiosity. "Oh my God," Jessica breathed, her voice barely above a whisper. "How did it get in here?" The question hung in the air, but there was no immediate answer, only the reality of the situation before them. A wild bear cub, probably no more than a few months old, trapped in a pet store storage room with a plastic bag tangled around its leg, looking at them with eyes that held both fear and a desperate need for help. Ethan took a slow step backward, his mind racing through everything he had ever heard about bears. Where there was a cub, there was usually a mother, and mother bears were notoriously protective of their young. But how could a mother bear be anywhere near here? They were in the middle of town, albeit a small mountain town, but still surrounded by buildings and roads and all the trappings of human civilization. "We need to call animal control," Ethan said, pulling out his phone, but his hand hesitated over the screen. The cub had started making different sounds now, almost like it was trying to communicate, and Lily was responding with her own baby babble, creating the strangest conversation any of them had ever witnessed. It was as if the two babies, one human and one bear, had found some common language that transcended species, a primitive understanding that existed before words or conscious thought. Jessica found herself mesmerized by the exchange, watching as her daughter's face lit up with joy rather than fear, her little hands clapping together softly as if she was playing a game with a new friend. The cub attempted to move toward them, but was held back by the bag around its leg, and it let out a frustrated cry that sounded heartbreakingly young. Without thinking, Jessica took a step forward, and Ethan grabbed her arm gently. "Jess, we don't know if it's safe," he warned, but she could see in his eyes that he was just as affected by the cub's plight as she was. The maternal instinct that had awakened in her when Lily was born seemed to extend beyond her own species in this moment, recognizing a baby in distress regardless of its form. "It's just a baby," she said softly, "and it's scared." As if understanding her words, the cub stopped struggling against the bag and sat down, looking up at them with an expression that was unmistakably pleading. Lily had been quiet for several moments, but suddenly she began squirming in Jessica's arms, reaching for the diaper bag that hung from the shopping cart. Jessica, confused but trusting her daughter's urgency, lowered her down enough that Lily could grab what she wanted. Her tiny fingers closed around one of her teething biscuits, the organic ones made from rice and vegetables that she loved to gnaw on for hours. Before either parent could react, Lily had thrown the biscuit toward the cub with surprising accuracy for a 10-month-old. The biscuit landed just a few feet from the frightened animal, and for a moment, everything was still. The cub sniffed the air cautiously, its black nose twitching as it processed this new development. Slowly, keeping its eyes on the humans, it stretched forward just enough to reach the biscuit with its free paw. The cub pulled the treat closer and gave it an experimental lick before taking a small bite. The change in its demeanor was immediate and remarkable. The tension in its small body seemed to ease, and it looked at Lily with what could only be described as gratitude. Lily clapped her hands again and made a happy gurgling sound, clearly pleased with herself. The simple act of sharing food, something so basic and fundamental to both human and animal experience, had created a bridge between them that no amount of rational thought could have built. "She's feeding it," Ethan said unnecessarily, his voice filled with wonder. He had seen his daughter share her toys with other babies at playgroup, had watched her learn the basics of human interaction, but this was something entirely different. This was an instinctive understanding that kindness transcended boundaries, that compassion didn't require common language or even common species. The cub finished the biscuit and looked hopefully at Lily, who was already reaching for another one from the bag. This time, Jessica helped her, pulling out 2 more biscuits. "Slowly, baby," she whispered to Lily, though she wasn't sure if she was talking about the speed of offering the food or the speed at which this surreal situation was unfolding. As Lily offered the second biscuit, holding it out in her chubby little hand, the cub made a decision that changed everything. It stood up on unsteady legs, the plastic bag still tangled around one paw, and took a tentative step forward, then another and another, until it was close enough that Lily could have touched it if Jessica hadn't been holding her back slightly. The cub sat down again, just out of reach, and accepted the biscuit from Lily's outstretched hand with the gentleness that made Jessica's eyes fill with tears. There was something profound happening here, something that went beyond a simple encounter between human and animal. It was as if they were witnessing the very essence of innocence, 2 young creatures who hadn't yet learned to fear each other, hadn't been taught the boundaries that adults carried like armor. The sound of footsteps in the main store broke the spell, and they heard Mr. Peterson's voice calling out, "Folks, I'm about to close up. You finding everything okay back there?" Ethan and Jessica exchanged a look that carried an entire conversation. What would they say? How could they explain what was happening here? The cub seemed to sense the change in atmosphere and retreated slightly, though it kept its eyes on Lily, who was making soft, reassuring sounds that seemed to be keeping the animal calm. "Mr. Peterson," Ethan called back, his voice carefully controlled. "Could you come here for a moment? We've found something unusual." The footsteps grew closer, and they could hear the old store owner muttering to himself about people not being able to find the dog food that was clearly marked. But when he rounded the corner and saw what was in his storage room, he stopped so abruptly that he nearly fell over. His mouth opened and closed several times, no sound coming out, as his brain tried to process the scene before him. A bear cub in his storage room, calmly eating baby biscuits from a 10-month-old child, while the child's parents stood guard like this was the most normal thing in the world. "Well, I'll be damned," he finally managed to say, his voice barely above a whisper. "Mr. Peterson," Jessica began, but the old man held up his hand, his eyes never leaving the cub. "In 43 years of running this store," he said slowly, "I've seen mice, rats, the occasional raccoon, and once a fox that somehow got into the ventilation system. But this—" He trailed off, shaking his head in disbelief. The cub, perhaps sensing another non-threat, had resumed eating the biscuit Lily had given it, seemingly unconcerned by the addition of another human to its audience. "How in the world did it get in here?" Mr. Peterson asked, the same question they had all been wondering. Ethan pointed to a ventilation grate near the floor that had been pushed aside, its screws missing and the metal bent as if something had forced its way through. "Looks like it came through there," he said. "But that leads to the outside. The real question is why. Why would a bear cub leave the forest and come into town, into a building, and get trapped in here?" Mr. Peterson moved closer, his movements slow and deliberate like someone approaching a skittish horse. He studied the cub, noting the bag around its leg, the slightly thin appearance of its body, the way it kept looking toward the door as if expecting something or someone. "It's looking for its mama," Mr. Peterson said quietly, and they all felt the weight of that statement. A lost cub, separated from its mother, desperate enough to venture into human territory in search of food or shelter, or perhaps just the comfort of not being alone. The tragedy of it made Jessica hold Lily a little tighter, imagining the terror of being separated from her child, the desperate lengths she would go to find her. As if sensing her mother's emotions, Lily reached out and patted Jessica's face with her small hand, then pointed at the cub and made a sound that was almost like a question. "Yes, baby," Jessica whispered. "It's lost its mommy." Lily's face scrunched up in the way it did before she cried, but instead of tears, she reached for the entire package of biscuits in the diaper bag. Her intention was clear, even if her motor skills weren't quite up to the task. She wanted to give all her biscuits to the sad bear baby. The purity of the gesture, the complete lack of calculation or self-interest, made all three adults stand in silent amazement. This was humanity at its most basic and best, the instinct to help, to share, to comfort, unfiltered by the fears and prejudices that adults accumulated like scars. Mr. Peterson pulled out his phone, but instead of calling animal control immediately, he seemed to be scrolling through his contacts. "I know a fellow," he said, "works with wildlife rehabilitation. He's helped me before with injured birds that flew into the store windows. Maybe he can help without making this harder than it needs to be." They all understood what he meant. Animal control might not be gentle, might see the cub as a threat rather than a frightened baby. The cub had finished the second biscuit and was now lying down, its energy seemingly depleted. The bag around its leg had loosened slightly from its movements, but it was still tangled enough to be a problem. "We need to get that bag off," Jessica said, her maternal instincts overriding her caution. It could cut off circulation or get infected. Ethan looked at her like she had suggested wrestling an alligator, but he could see the determination in her eyes. This was the same woman who had faced 18 hours of labor without complaint, who had learned to function on 2 hours of sleep when Lily was a newborn, who had a strength that came from love rather than muscle. "Jess," he started, but she was already handing Lily to him, her movements decisive. "Keep her happy," she told him. "Keep her talking to it or whatever it is they're doing. The cub trusts her." It was true, bizarre as it was. The bear cub's eyes tracked Lily as Ethan took her, and when the baby continued her soft babbling, the cub seemed to relax slightly. Jessica moved slowly, telegraphing her intentions with every movement. She pulled out another biscuit and placed it on the ground between her and the cub, then another a little closer to her, creating a trail. The cub watched her with intelligent eyes, seeming to understand that this was different from Lily's innocent offering. As the cub stretched forward to reach the first biscuit, Jessica spoke in the same soft tone she used when Lily was upset. "It's okay, little one. We're going to help you. Your mama is probably looking for you, and we're going to make sure you get back to her." The cub's ears twitched at her voice, and it took the biscuit but didn't retreat. When it reached for the second one, Jessica slowly extended her hand, not toward the cub's head, but toward the tangled bag. The cub froze, and for a moment, everyone held their breath. Then Lily made a sound, something between a laugh and a coo, and the cub's attention shifted to her just long enough for Jessica to grab the edge of the bag. What happened next was a blur of gentle determination and remarkable trust. The cub didn't pull away as Jessica carefully worked the handles loose, occasionally pausing when the animal showed signs of distress. Lily kept up her baby commentary, and incredibly the cub seemed to be listening, its eyes moving between the baby and Jessica as if understanding that these strange creatures were trying to help. When the bag finally came free, the cub immediately tested its freed leg, stretching and flexing as if making sure everything still worked. Then it did something that none of them expected. It moved closer to Jessica and bumped its head against her hand just once, the same way a cat might show affection. "Did it just thank you?" Ethan asked, his voice filled with awe. Jessica couldn't speak, her throat tight with emotion as she carefully stroked the cub's head once, feeling the coarse fur under her fingers. This wild creature, which should have seen her as a threat, had just shown trust and perhaps even gratitude. It was a moment that transcended the ordinary rules of the world, a glimpse into something deeper and more connected than the divisions humans usually drew between themselves and nature. The cub then turned to Lily, who was bouncing excitedly in Ethan's arms, and made a soft chuffing sound that made the baby giggle with delight. Mr. Peterson had been on his phone during this exchange, speaking quietly to someone. When he hung up, he had a strange expression on his face, something between confusion and wonder. "My wildlife friend is on his way," he said. But he told me something interesting. There have been reports of an injured adult bear in the area, a mother who was hit by a car a few days ago but ran off before anyone could help. They've been looking for her, worried she might have cubs. The implications of this information settled over them like a weight. An injured mother, a lost cub, the desperate journey into human territory that had led to this moment. "She might be too hurt to care for it," Jessica said, her hand still resting gently on the cub's head. "That's why it came looking for food." The tragedy of the situation was almost overwhelming, but Lily seemed unaffected by the adult's somber mood. She was still communicating with the cub in her baby language, and the cub was responding with small sounds and movements, creating a conversation that needed no translation. It was pure connection, unfiltered by the complexities that would come with age and understanding. In this moment, they were just two young beings, finding comfort in each other's company. The sound of a vehicle pulling up outside broke the quiet moment, and Mr. Peterson went to let in his contact. The cub tensed at the new sounds, but Lily's continued babbling seemed to keep it from panicking. They could hear voices approaching, Mr. Peterson explaining the situation, and then a man appeared in the doorway. He was younger than they expected, probably in his early 30s. With the kind of calm demeanor that came from working with frightened animals. He took in the scene, his eyes widening slightly at the sight of the cub so close to the humans, particularly the baby. "Well, this is a first," he said softly, not moving from the doorway. "I'm Connor Adams from the Wildlife Rehabilitation Center. Mr. Peterson called me." He studied the cub with experienced eyes, noting its condition, the way it was sitting, its apparent comfort with the humans. "How long has it been here?" he asked. Ethan explained what they knew, which wasn't much, and Connor nodded thoughtfully. "And the baby has been talking to it?" The question might have sounded absurd in any other context, but they all knew what they had witnessed. "They seem to understand each other," Jessica said, knowing how impossible it sounded. Connor didn't dismiss it, though. Instead, he smiled slightly. "Young animals, including humans, often communicate in ways we don't fully understand. Before we learn fear, before we learn boundaries, there's just connection." He pulled out his phone and showed them a photo. "This is the mother we've been tracking. She has a radio collar from a previous relocation. We lost her signal near here 2 days ago." The bear in the photo was beautiful, with the same dark brown fur as the cub and eyes that held an intelligence that was almost human. "Is she okay?" Jessica asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. Connor's expression was carefully neutral. "We don't know. The collar might have been damaged in the accident, or she might be hiding somewhere, too injured to move far. Bears are incredibly resilient, but with a cub to care for..." He trailed off, the implications clear. Without its mother, the cub's chances of survival were slim, and even with human intervention, raising a wild bear was complicated and often unsuccessful. The cub needed its mother, not just for food, but for all the lessons that would help it survive in the wild. Lily had been quiet during this exchange, but suddenly she started squirming in Ethan's arms, pointing insistently at the door to the main store. Her agitation was unusual, the kind she only showed when she really wanted something. "What is it, sweetheart?" Ethan asked, but Lily just kept pointing and making urgent sounds. The cub, surprisingly, stood up and also looked toward the door. Its ears perked forward, as if hearing something the adults couldn't. Connor noticed this immediately, his professional interest piqued. "They're both reacting to something," he said, moving slowly toward the door. As they all moved into the main store, following the strange guidance of baby and cub, they could see through the large front windows that the parking lot was no longer empty. There, at the very edge of the light cast by the store's exterior lamps, was a shape that made them all stop breathing for a moment. It was large, dark, and unmistakably the silhouette of an adult bear, but instead of the aggressive posture they might have expected, the bear was sitting, just sitting, as if waiting. The cub made a sound that was definitely recognition, and Lily clapped her hands as if greeting a friend. "That's her," Connor breathed. "That's the mother." She was clearly injured, favoring her left side, and even from a distance, they could see the exhaustion in her posture. But she had found her way here, to where her cub had gone, and she was waiting. The intelligence of it, the determination, The maternal drive that had brought her to this place despite her injuries was both heartbreaking and awe-inspiring. She knew, Jessica whispered. Somehow she knew her baby was here and safe. Connor was already on his phone, calling for backup, for the equipment they would need to help both bears. But his voice was excited rather than alarmed. If we can treat her injuries, he was saying to someone, if she's not too far gone, we can reunite them. Both of them have a chance. The cub was now at the window, standing on its hind legs with its paws against the glass, making soft calling sounds to its mother. The mother bear's head turned toward the sound, and even through the glass, they could see the moment of recognition, the relief that seemed to wash over her. Lily was also at the window now, Ethan holding her up so she could see. She pressed her little hands against the glass right next to the cub's paws, and for a moment, the image was perfect and impossible. A human baby and a bear cub, side by side, looking out at a wounded mother who had trusted humans enough to wait for help rather than attack. It was a testament to something larger than any of them. A reminder that the divisions between species were sometimes more fluid than humans like to believe, that compassion and understanding could bridge gaps that seemed insurmountable. We need to get the cub outside, Connor said, but carefully. The mother is weak, but she's still a wild bear, and maternal instincts are powerful. He looked at Lily, who was still pressed against the window, and made a decision that went against every protocol he had been taught. Keep the baby visible, he said to Ethan. As strange as it sounds, I think she understands that your daughter helped her cub. Animals know kindness when they see it. It seemed impossible, attributing such complex understanding to a bear, but nothing about this evening had been ordinary. They developed a simple plan. Connor would open the front door of the store while Ethan and Jessica stayed back with Lily, keeping her visible but safe. The cub would be allowed to go to its mother on its own. No forcing, no frightening it into running. It was a plan that required trust in the animal's intelligence and in the strange connection that had formed in the storage room. As Connor slowly opened the door, the evening air rushed in, carrying the scent of pine and earth and something wild. The cub's nose twitched, and it looked back at Lily one more time. What happened next would stay with all of them for the rest of their lives. Lily, in her innocent wisdom, waved bye-bye to the cub, the same way she waved to her grandparents when they left after a visit. The cub paused, and in a movement that seemed deliberate and conscious, it raised one paw slightly before turning and walking out the door, not running, not fleeing, but walking with dignity toward its waiting mother. The reunion was quiet, not the dramatic scene one might expect. The mother bear sniffed her cub thoroughly, checking for injuries, and then simply pulled it close with one large paw, holding it against her injured side. Connor's backup arrived then, a van equipped for wildlife rescue, and two other specialists who moved with the same calm efficiency. They sedated the mother bear from a safe distance, the tranquilizer delivered with practiced precision. As the large bear slowly lay down, the cub stayed right beside her, showing a loyalty that transcended its fear of the humans approaching. We'll take them both to the rehabilitation center, Connor explained to the watching family. Her injuries look treatable, mostly lacerations and possibly some broken ribs. With proper care, they should both be able to return to the wild. As the team carefully loaded both bears into the specialized van, Connor turned back to them with an expression of genuine amazement. In 15 years of doing this work, he said, I've never seen anything like what happened here tonight. That cub should have been terrified, aggressive, or completely shut down. Instead, it accepted help, showed trust, and even demonstrated what I can only call gratitude. And your daughter. He looked at Lily, who was now sleepy in Jessica's arms. She has a gift. The way she connected with that cub, it was pure and instinctive and beautiful. The van pulled away, taking the bears to safety and medical care, and the parking lot suddenly seemed very empty and ordinary. Mr. Foss Peterson stood with them, shaking his head in continued disbelief. "I suppose I should check how that cub got into my ventilation system," he said, but there was no anger in his voice, only a kind of bemused wonder. "Though I have to say, in all my years, this is a story nobody's going to believe." He looked at Lily, who was now definitely falling asleep, her adventure having exhausted her. That little one there did something special tonight. She showed us all something about kindness that we adults tend to forget. As they drove home, Lily asleep in her car seat and the evening's events still surreal in their minds, Ethan reached over and took Jessica's hand. "Did that really happen?" he asked, needing confirmation that they had indeed spent their evening helping reunite a bear cub with its injured mother, facilitated by their 10-month-old daughter's innocent compassion. Jessica squeezed his hand, her own mind still processing everything. "It did," she said softly, "and I think it happened exactly the way it was supposed to. Lily saw a baby in need and didn't see a bear, didn't see danger, just saw someone who needed help. Maybe that's the lesson here, that kindness doesn't need to be complicated." They rode in comfortable silence for a while, the mountain road winding through darkness punctuated by the occasional house light. The normal world seemed both more real and less significant after what they had witnessed. Their ordinary trip to the pet store had become something extraordinary, a reminder that magic still existed in the world, that connections could form across any boundary, and that sometimes the universe conspired to put the right people in the right place at the right time. As they pulled into their driveway, their golden retriever Max barking a welcome from inside the house, life seemed to return to its regular rhythm, but they knew they were changed by what had happened. That night, after Lily was bathed and fed and tucked into her crib, Jessica stood watching her sleep. The baby's face was peaceful, showing no sign that she had done anything unusual that day, but Jessica knew that somewhere, in a rehabilitation center not far away, a bear cub was curled up next to its mother, both of them safe because a human baby had shown pure, uncomplicated kindness. She thought about all the lessons she would try to teach Lily as she grew, about sharing and caring and being good to others, and realized that perhaps Lily had already understood the most important lesson of all, that love and compassion were universal languages that required no translation. Ethan found her there, standing in the soft glow of the nightlight, and put his arm around her. "What are you thinking?" he asked quietly. Jessica leaned into him, drawing comfort from his presence. "I'm thinking about how we spend so much time teaching children about the world, but maybe we should spend more time learning from them." Lily didn't see a wild animal tonight. She saw a baby who was scared and hungry, and she shared her food without a second thought. No fear, no hesitation, just kindness. They stood together, watching their daughter sleep, both of them knowing that they had witnessed something precious and rare. The next morning brought a return to routine, but the extraordinary had a way of leaving its mark on the ordinary. As Jessica fed Lily breakfast, she noticed the baby looking at her remaining teething biscuits with unusual interest. Then, to her amazement, Lily picked up one of the biscuits and held it out to her mother, making the same soft sound she had made to the cub. It was as if she was practicing kindness, reinforcing the lesson she had learned or perhaps taught. Jessica accepted the biscuit with tears in her eyes, understanding that her daughter had been fundamentally changed by the experience, had learned that giving brought its own joy. Connor called that afternoon with an update. The mother bear's injuries were serious but treatable, and she was responding well to medical care. The cub had stayed by her side throughout the examination and treatment, showing the same remarkable calm it had displayed in the store. "We're optimistic about a full recovery," he said, "and we should be able to release them back into the wild in about 6 weeks. The mother will be fitted with a new tracking collar, and we'll monitor them to make sure they're doing well." He paused, then added, "I know this is unusual, but when we do release them, would you like to be there? I think it would be fitting, given what your family did for them." The invitation was unexpected, but immediately felt right. Of course they should be there, to see the conclusion of the story that had begun in a pet store storage room. Jessica agreed eagerly, already imagining Lily's reaction to seeing the bears again, healthy and free. But Connor had more to say. "I've been thinking about what happened," he continued, "and I've been in touch with some colleagues who study animal behavior. What occurred between your daughter and that cub, it's the kind of interaction that challenges our understanding of interspecies communication. With your permission, we'd like to document this story, not for publicity but for science, to better understand these connections." The idea that their strange evening might contribute to scientific understanding added another layer of meaning to the experience. They agreed, with the condition that Lily's privacy be protected, and over the following weeks they shared their story with researchers who listened with fascination and respect. Meanwhile, life continued its normal rhythm, but with an undercurrent of anticipation for the day when they would see the bears again. Lily seemed to sense this anticipation, occasionally pointing at bears in her picture books and making the same sounds she had made that night, as if practicing for a reunion. 6 weeks passed more quickly than expected, filled with the usual chaos of raising a toddler, work responsibilities, and the approaching holiday season. Then Connor called with the news they had been waiting for. The bears were ready for release. The mother had made a full recovery, gaining weight and showing all the signs of a healthy adult bear. The cub had grown considerably, no longer the frightened baby they had found, but still young enough to need its mother's protection and guidance. The release would take place in a protected area of the forest, far enough from human habitation to be safe, but close enough that the bears could be monitored. On the morning of the release, they drove through a light snowfall to the designated spot, a clearing in the forest where Connor and his team were already preparing. The transport van was there, and inside it they could hear movement, the sounds of 2 healthy bears ready to return home. Lily, now able to walk with increasing confidence, toddled through the snow, holding her parents' hands, her eyes bright with excitement. She seemed to understand that something important was happening, that this was connected to that night in the store that had become a favorite bedtime story. When Connor opened the van's specialized cage, the mother bear emerged first, majestic and powerful, her injuries now just faint scars hidden beneath thick fur. She stood for a moment, testing the air, her intelligent eyes surveying the forest that was her home. Then the cub appeared, significantly larger than they remembered but still clearly her baby, staying close to her side. The bears noticed the humans immediately, and for a moment that stretched like eternity, the mother bear's eyes met Jessica's. There was recognition there, impossible as it seemed, an acknowledgement of what had passed between them. Then Lily did something that surprised everyone. She pulled out a teething biscuit from her pocket, one her mother had given her for the car ride, and held it up toward the bears, not throwing it, not trying to get closer, just holding it up like a greeting, like a reminder of how this all began. The cub saw it first, and made a soft sound that might have been recognition. The mother bear huffed gently, a sound Connor later said was often associated with contentment or acknowledgement in bears. Then, with dignity and grace, both bears turned and walked into the forest, the cub occasionally looking back until they disappeared among the snow-covered trees. "They'll do well," Connor said softly, watching the tracking device that showed the bears moving deeper into the forest. The mother knows this territory, and there's plenty of food sources. They'll den soon for the winter, and by spring the cub will be ready to start learning independence. He looked at Lily, who was still holding up the biscuit, watching the spot where the bears had vanished. "Your daughter gave them something that no amount of medical care could have provided," he said. "She gave them proof that humans could be trusted, that kindness existed across species boundaries. That might save their lives someday if they encounter humans again." As they drove home, Lily fell asleep clutching the uneaten biscuit, a smile on her face that suggested dreams of bears and forests and friendships that transcended the ordinary rules of the world. Ethan and Jessica rode in contemplative silence, both understanding that they had been part of something larger than themselves, a story that would become family legend but was also deeply personal and transformative. They had learned from their daughter that kindness was not complicated, that connection didn't require common language, and that sometimes the most profound moments came from the simplest acts of compassion. Weeks turned to months, and Connor occasionally sent updates about the bears, captured on trail cameras throughout the forest. The mother and cub were thriving, their bond strong, their fear of humans balanced with an unusual tolerance that suggested they remembered the kindness shown to them. Each update was received with joy in the Marshall household, where Lily would look at the grainy photos with delight, pointing and making her bear sounds, remembering her friend. The experience had become part of their family's fabric, a reminder that extraordinary moments could emerge from ordinary evenings, that magic existed in the willingness to help, to connect, to see beyond surface differences. As Lily grew and began to speak in sentences rather than baby babble, she would sometimes talk about her bear, the friend she had helped when she was a baby. Other parents might have dismissed it as imagination, but Ethan and Jessica knew better. They had witnesses, they had photos, they had a story that defied easy explanation but was absolutely true. They had learned that the world was more connected than most people realized, that kindness could bridge any gap, and that sometimes a baby's innocent compassion could save lives and change hearts. One evening, almost a year after the original encounter, they received a special video from Connor. It was from a trail camera deep in the forest, showing the mother bear with not just one cub but two. The original one now almost fully grown, and a new tiny cub, probably born during the winter denning. The family was healthy, thriving, living the life they were meant to live. But what made the video truly special was what happened at the end. The original cub, now an adolescent bear, paused in front of the camera and stood up on its hind legs, just for a moment, almost as if waving, before dropping back down and following its family into the forest. "Coincidence," Ethan said, but his voice suggested he didn't really believe it. Jessica didn't even pretend to rationalize it. She simply called Lily over to see the video, and the toddler's reaction was pure joy. "My bear remembers," she said clearly, her language skills having developed remarkably in the past year. She waved at the screen and then ran to get one of her toy bears to show it the video, as if it too needed to see that their friend was okay. The innocence of it, the pure belief that connections endured across time and distance, was both heartbreaking and beautiful. That night, as they tucked Lily into bed, she asked a question that showed wisdom beyond her years. "Mama, why did the baby bear come to our store?" Jessica thought carefully about how to answer, wanting to honor both the mystery and the reality of what had happened. "I think," she said slowly, "that sometimes when someone needs help, the universe finds a way to connect them with someone who can provide it. The cub needed help, and somehow it found its way to you, because you had exactly the kind of help it needed, not just food, but kindness, without fear. Lily seemed to consider this, her little face serious in the glow of her nightlight. "So I was supposed to help?" she asked. Ethan, standing in the doorway, answered this time. "Maybe we were all supposed to be there, sweetheart. You to show kindness. Mommy to help free the cub from the bag, Mr. Peterson to call for the right help, and Connor to make sure the bears could go home safely. Sometimes things happen that seem random, but turn out to be exactly right." Lily smiled, satisfied with this explanation, and hugged her teddy bear closer. "I'm glad we helped," she said simply, and then closed her eyes, ready for sleep. As parents often do, Ethan and Jessica lingered for a moment, watching their daughter sleep, both of them marveling at how much she had taught them. The encounter with the bears had been a defining moment, not just for what had happened, but for what it had revealed about the capacity for connection and compassion that existed in the world. They had seen their baby daughter bridge a gap between species with nothing more than innocent kindness and a willingness to share. They had witnessed the intelligence and trust of wild animals, the dedication of people like Connor who worked to protect and heal, and the way a community could come together around something beautiful and unexpected. Mr. Peterson had framed a photo from that night, taken on Connor's phone, showing Lily at the window with the cub, their hands and paws almost touching through the glass. It hung in his store now with a simple caption, "Kindness knows no boundaries." He said it was the most asked about photo in the store, that people loved hearing the story, especially the part about how a baby's compassion had saved 2 bears. He had also fixed the ventilation system, but he admitted he'd made sure there was always a small gap, just in case another creature needed shelter. Though, hopefully, he'd say with a laugh, they'll choose a time when we're open and can help properly. The story spread through their small mountain town, becoming one of those local legends that grew with each telling. But for the Marshall family, it remained personal and profound, a reminder of a night when the ordinary became extraordinary, when their baby daughter had shown them that the most powerful force in the world might just be simple, uncomplicated kindness. They had learned that connections could form in the most unexpected ways, that communication didn't always require words, and that sometimes the universe conspired to put exactly the right people in exactly the right place to make a difference. As winter deepened and snow blanketed their town, they would sometimes think about the bears, safely denned somewhere in the forest, the mother and her cubs warm and protected. Connor had assured them that the bears' territory was far from any planned development, that they would have the space and resources they needed to thrive. The tracking collar would provide data for years, contributing to the understanding and protection of black bears in the region. In a way, Lily's act of kindness would ripple outward, affecting not just the 2 bears she had helped, but potentially many others through the research and conservation efforts that followed. Life moved forward with its usual mixture of challenges and joys, but the family carried with them the knowledge that they had been part of something magical. Lily grew from a toddler into a child who was unusually empathetic, always the first to comfort a crying classmate or to share her snacks with someone who had forgotten theirs. Her teachers would comment on her remarkable ability to connect with children who were shy or different, how she seemed to see past surface differences to the person underneath. Jessica and Ethan knew where this gift had been nurtured, in a storage room on an ordinary evening that had become anything but ordinary. Years later, when Lily was old enough to truly understand the full story of that night, she would ask to visit the spot where the bears had been released. They would stand in the same clearing, now older and carrying the accumulated experiences of years, but still able to feel the magic of that moment when 2 bears had walked back into the wild. Lily would no longer remember the actual event, being too young when it happened, but she knew the story by heart, had seen the photos and videos, had heard from Mr. Peterson and Connor about her remarkable connection with the cub. "Do you think they remember us?" she would ask, looking into the forest where somewhere generations of bears now lived, descendants perhaps of the mother and cub they had saved. Jessica would put her arm around her daughter, now almost as tall as she was, and say, "I think kindness leaves a mark on the world that doesn't fade." Whether they remember us specifically doesn't matter as much as the fact that they lived, that they thrived, that they had families of their own. Your kindness that night created ripples that are still spreading, in ways we probably can't even imagine. And it was true. The story of the baby who saved the bears had inspired others in their community to support wildlife conservation efforts, had led to better protocols for handling injured wildlife in their region, had even influenced some young people to pursue careers in wildlife biology or rehabilitation. Connor often spoke at schools about the incident, using it to teach children about compassion for all living things, about the intelligence and emotional capacity of animals, and about how individual actions could make a real difference. He would always end with the same message. A 10-month-old baby saw a scared animal and chose to share her food. If she could show that kind of compassion, imagine what all of us could do if we chose kindness first. The ripples continued to spread in ways both seen and unseen. Mr. Peterson's store became known as a wildlife-friendly establishment, and he partnered with Connor's Rehabilitation Center to sponsor injured animal care. He kept a donation box by the register with a photo of Lily and the cub, and customers regularly contributed, knowing their money would help other animals in need. The ventilation system that had allowed the cub to enter was redesigned not to keep animals out, but to provide a safe way to help them if they did get in, with a special alert system that would notify Connor's team immediately. But perhaps the most profound impact was on the Marshall family itself. They had learned that evening that the world was full of connections waiting to be made, that kindness was a language that transcended species, and that sometimes the most important moments in life came disguised as ordinary evenings. They had seen their baby daughter demonstrate a wisdom that adults often lost, the understanding that we are all connected, all deserving of compassion, all capable of bridging the gaps that seem to divide us. It had changed how they moved through the world, making them more aware of opportunities to help, more willing to see beyond surface differences, more open to the magic that existed in everyday moments. The story became part of their family mythology, told at gatherings, shared with new friends, passed down as a reminder of what was possible when fear was replaced with compassion. But it was also a living story, continuing to unfold as Lily grew into a young woman who carried that early lesson with her. She would volunteer at animal shelters, study environmental science, and always approach the world with the same open-hearted curiosity that had led her to share her biscuits with a frightened bear cub. The seed, planted that night in a pet store storage room, had grown into a life philosophy, a way of being in the world that honored connection over division, kindness over fear. Sometimes, on quiet evenings when the family was together, they would look at the old photos and marvel at how young they all looked, how impossible the whole thing still seemed even with photographic evidence. They would remember Mr. Peterson's amazement, Connor's professional excitement, the mother bear waiting patiently in the parking lot, trusting that her baby was safe. They would remember the moment when the cub had bumped its head against Jessica's hand in what could only be interpreted as gratitude, and how Lily had waved goodbye as if saying farewell to a friend. These memories were treasures, proof that the world was more magical than most people believed, that connections could form in the most unexpected ways, and that kindness, especially the pure, uncomplicated kindness of a child, had the power to change everything. The story could have ended there, a perfect circle of kindness and connection, but life has a way of adding unexpected postscripts. Years later, when Lily was in college studying wildlife biology, she received a call from Connor, now the director of the rehabilitation center. A female bear had been brought in, elderly and nearing the end of her life, with an old tracking collar that had stopped transmitting years ago. When they checked the collar's serial number, they discovered it was the same bear, the mother from that night so long ago. She had lived a long life for a wild bear, had raised multiple cubs successfully, had become what Connor called a matriarch of the forest. Lily drove through the night to get there, some deep part of her needing to say goodbye to this creature that had been part of such a formative moment in her life. The bear was peaceful, resting in a specially prepared enclosure that gave her comfort in her final days. When Lily approached, the old bear lifted her head, and their eyes met. It was probably imagination, probably the human tendency to see recognition where none existed, but Lily could have sworn there was something there, some acknowledgement of their shared history. She sat with the bear for hours, not speaking, just being present, offering the same quiet compassion she had given as a baby. When the bear passed peacefully the next morning, Lily was there, along with Connor and several other staff members who had come to respect this particular bear over the years of tracking her. They buried her in the forest she had called home, in a spot that overlooked the valley where she had raised so many cubs. Lily placed a small stone marker there, nothing that would disturb the natural environment, just something to mark the spot where a brave mother bear was returned to the earth. On the marker, she had carved simple words. She trusted us. We were worthy of that trust. Standing there in the forest, surrounded by the continuity of life, the cycles of birth and death and renewal, Lily understood that the story that had begun when she was a baby had come full circle. But circles, she realized, were not endings but continuities. Each completion the beginning of another revolution. The bears she had helped save had gone on to have cubs of their own. Those cubs had had cubs, and somewhere in this forest were the living legacy of one night's kindness. She thought about all the people who had been touched by the story, all the animals that had been helped because of the awareness it raised, all the connections that had been made because people had heard about a baby who chose compassion over fear. As she walked back through the forest, Lily felt the presence of her parents, though they were miles away. They had given her the space to have this moment alone, understanding that some experiences needed to be processed in solitude. But she knew they were thinking of her, remembering that night as she was, feeling the bittersweet completion of a story that had shaped all their lives. She pulled out her phone and sent them a simple message. She lived a good, long life. Her cubs thrived. The kindness continues. She knew they would understand, would feel the same mixture of sadness and gratitude that she was experiencing. The drive home was contemplative, filled with memories and reflections on how a single moment of compassion could ripple through time. Lily thought about the children she would one day have, how she would tell them this story, how she would teach them that kindness was not just a nice idea but a force that could change the world in real, tangible ways. She thought about the cub, now probably an old bear himself if he still lived, somewhere in the forest with cubs and perhaps grand cubs of his own. She wondered if bears passed down memories the way humans did, if somewhere in their genetic code or their behavior was encoded the knowledge that sometimes humans could be trusted. Back at college, Lily threw herself into her studies with renewed purpose. She specialized in human-wildlife interaction, focusing on ways to reduce conflict and increase coexistence. Her thesis advisor, knowing her history, encouraged her to write about the incident, to add her voice to the academic literature on interspecies communication and compassion. The resulting paper, co-authored with Connor and including observations from Mr. Peterson and her parents, became widely cited in the field, not for its scientific rigor alone, but for its documentation of something usually dismissed as unscientific: the power of emotional connection across species boundaries. The paper led to speaking engagements, conservation work, and eventually a career dedicated to protecting wildlife and educating people about coexistence. But Lily never forgot that it all started with a simple act: a baby sharing her food with another baby who happened to be a different species. She would often end her presentations with that reminder that conservation and compassion were not complex concepts requiring advanced degrees to understand. They were as simple as recognizing suffering and choosing to help, as basic as seeing ourselves in others, even when those others looked nothing like us. Meanwhile, Mr. Peterson's pet store had become something of a local landmark. He had long since retired, passing the business to his daughter, but he still came in regularly to tell the story to anyone who would listen. The photo of Lily and the cub remained on the wall, now joined by dozens of other photos of animals that had been helped over the years, a gallery of compassion that had grown from that single night. School groups would visit to hear the story and learn about wildlife conservation, and Mr. Peterson, well into his 80s, would light up as he recounted that extraordinary evening when a baby, a bear, and a community had come together in the most unexpected way. Jessica and Ethan, now grandparents themselves, would sometimes stand in that same spot in the store, looking at the photo of their baby daughter and the cub. They would hold their grandchildren's hands and tell them the story, watching their eyes widen with wonder at the idea that their mother had once saved bears. The grandchildren would inevitably ask if they could save bears too, and Jessica would kneel down to their level and say, "You can save anything that needs saving, if you're brave enough to be kind." It was the lesson Lily had taught them all those years ago, distilled to its essence. The forest where the bears had been released was eventually designated as a protected wildlife corridor, partly due to the advocacy of Lily and others who had been inspired by the story. It became a place where bears and other wildlife could move safely between larger wilderness areas, reducing human-wildlife conflict and ensuring genetic diversity in the populations. A small plaque at the entrance to the corridor told the story of the baby and the bear, reminding visitors that conservation was not just about protecting land, but about fostering compassion and connection between humans and the wild. Connor, in his retirement speech as director of the Rehabilitation Center, would say that in 40 years of working with wildlife, the night he was called to Peterson's Pet Supply remained the most profound experience of his career. Not because it was the most dramatic rescue or the most difficult case, but because it had shown him that the capacity for interspecies understanding was far greater than most people imagined. He had built his entire approach to rehabilitation around what he learned that night: that animals were capable of trust, gratitude, and complex emotional connections, and that humans, especially young humans, had an innate ability to communicate across species boundaries when they approached with open hearts. The ripples continued, generation after generation. Children who heard the story grew up to be adults who thought differently about wildlife. Some became conservationists. Others simply became more compassionate people who understood that kindness had no boundaries. The bears in the forest continued to thrive, their population healthy and stable, living testament to the power of one night's compassion. And somewhere in the genetic memory of those bears, perhaps, was the knowledge that not all humans were threats, that some could be trusted, that kindness could come from the most unexpected sources. As Lily aged, becoming a respected voice in conservation, a mother, and eventually a grandmother herself, she would often return to that forest clearing, sometimes alone, sometimes with family, always with the same sense of wonder that such an extraordinary story had begun with such an ordinary evening. She would tell her grandchildren, as her parents had told theirs, about the night when she was just a baby and had saved 2 bears with nothing more than teething biscuits and an open heart. The children would always ask if it was really true, if it had really happened, and she would show them the photos, the videos, the scientific papers, the protected forest that existed because of that night. But more than the evidence, she would tell them about the feeling of it, the sense of connection that transcended species, the understanding that we were all part of the same world, the same story, the same endless cycle of life helping life. She would teach them that kindness was not weak but powerful, that compassion was not naive but wise, that the divisions we saw between ourselves and others were often illusions that could be dissolved by a single act of generosity. She would tell them that they carried within them the same capacity for connection that she had shown as a baby, that we all did, if we could just remember how to see with innocent eyes. The story never really ended because stories like this don't end. They continue in every act of kindness, every moment of connection, every choice to help rather than harm. They live in the protected forests and the thriving wildlife, in the children who grow up believing in compassion, in the adults who remember that magic is real and lives in the space between species, between individuals, between hearts that choose to be open. The baby who saved the bears became a woman who saved many more, who inspired others to save even more, creating an endless chain of compassion that started with a single moment of innocent generosity. And in the forest, bears continued to live and thrive, raising their cubs with the ancient knowledge of survival, but perhaps also with something else, a genetic memory of kindness, a cellular understanding that sometimes, in the most desperate moments, help could come from the most unexpected places. They would den each winter and emerge each spring, part of the endless cycle that connected all living things. And if sometimes a bear seemed unusually tolerant of humans, if sometimes one would pause and look at people with something almost like recognition, well, perhaps that was just imagination. Or perhaps it was the legacy of a baby's kindness, still rippling through the world, still connecting hearts across every boundary that seemed to divide us. The storage room at Peterson's Pet Supply was eventually renovated, but they kept one small section unchanged, a little shrine to that night when everything had shifted. Visitors would sometimes stand there, trying to imagine the scene. A frightened cub, a brave baby, a moment of connection that had changed so many lives. They would read the plaque that told the story and look at the photos that documented it. But more than that, they would feel something. A sense of possibility, a reminder that the world was full of magic if we just knew how to see it. And sometimes, late in the evening when the store was quiet, employees would swear they could hear something in that room. Not frightening, but comforting, like an echo of that long-ago night when kindness had triumphed over fear.